as humans, you and I both have skeletons within our bodies, as do most animals. But which animal had the first skeleton? Was it even an animal? First, I want to start with, what do we actually mean by skeleton? Because you'd be surprised at how many different types of skeletons are out there. All vertebrate animals that have vertebrae, like ourselves, have endoskeletons or internal skeletons. But invertebrate animals without vertebrae, things like corals, sponges, clams, snails, urchins, sand dollars, jellyfish, crustaceans, insects, etc., can have internal skeletons, endoskeletons, like us, or sometimes have exoskeletons, external skeletons. Things like shells, seashells, are external skeletons or protection for mollusks, clams, snails, etc. And things like the exoskeletons of crustaceans or insects, which molt their exoskeletons and then regrow them. Or invertebrates might have no skeleton at all, like jellyfish or worms. And you might be surprised to learn that there is a third thing, other than vertebrate animals and invertebrate animals, that can have skeletons, and that is microorganisms. So not animals at all, but microbes, single-celled organisms, some of them at least, can have skeletons. Typically, though, these are not internal endoskeletons like ourselves, but they have exoskeletons, things like tiny micro-sized shells. Sometimes we call these tests instead of shells, and so you'll hear me maybe refer to, for example, this right here. This is a foraminifera or foram. These guys have tests, but they're essentially shells. They're just really tiny. You can see this scale is 0.1 millimeters, so quite small. However, you would be surprised at how large some of the tests or shells of forams can get. I think the largest is like 20 centimeters, something like that, which for a single-celled organism is insane. Granted, the cell itself isn't that big, just the shell that it produces. But anyway, they're typically much smaller. And not only do skeletons differ in terms of being endo or exo, internal or external, but they can also differ in terms of mineralogy, which is just composition. They can be made of calcium phosphate, like our own skeletons, or they can be organic material, like cartilage, and these are the two main types of skeletons we see in vertebrate animals. But they can also be made of carbonate or silica. The carbonate skeletons are things like corals, mollusks, and a lot of other invertebrates have carbonate skeletons, and they're typically calcium carbonate, which can be minerals like aragonite, calcite, etc. Silica-producing organisms, or siliceous organisms, like sponges, for example, or some sponges, many sponges produce calcium carbonate, some produce silica. The group of sponges that produces silica skeletons are called glass sponges because silica is what makes up glass. And lastly, invertebrate organisms also can produce organic skeletons, not necessarily like cartilaginous fish, like sharks that produce cartilage skeletons in a way, but they can produce things like insect exoskeletons are made of chitin, which is an organic material, or crustacean exoskeletons, things like lobsters, shrimp, etc., have chitin exoskeletons. And lastly, in the microbial world, at least the microbial world that is skeleton producing, these guys typically use carbonate, calcium carbonate, or silica to produce their skeletons. Organisms like coccolithophores and foraminifera are common ones that use calcium carbonate, and diatoms and radiolarians are the common ones that use silica. And again, when you're looking at these images, keep in mind the scale of these is really tiny. Microbial, you could not see it with the naked eye. You would have to look through a microscope, which, as you can see, some of these structures are pretty magnificent. So it's pretty crazy that we can pick up a bunch of sand on a beach and maybe some of these crazy intricate detailed structures are in there and we just don't know because we can't tell with our naked eye. But to go back to the question that inspired this video, who built the first skeleton? Well, the first skeletonized vertebrates, like ourselves, were fish. But the first fish, or rather the first fish-like creatures that evolved into fish, were not even vertebrates. They didn't have vertebrae. They only had notochords, which is kind of an organic a precursor to vertebrae, at least in more modern vertebrates. But this does not count as an official skeleton, from what I read at least. So although these guys evolved around 530 million years ago, it was probably later that the first official skeletonized vertebrate evolved. Who was that? Well, it was potentially the conodont. Conodonts are known mainly from their teeth. In fact, I think the word conodont was used initially to describe the fossil record of conodont teeth. And we actually use the word conodont animal to refer to the animal that held their teeth, because we figured out way later what the animal might have looked like from very, very not great preserved like body fossils. But what we mostly have is very well preserved teeth fossils, because these were the hard parts of those animals. However, I say potentially here because some people, well, many people, recognize conodonts as the first official vertebrates or very early vertebrates, if not the first. However, there have been other reports saying that they're not vertebrates at all. In fact, they didn't have vertebrae, and it's very hard to tell when all that we really have preserved of them is their teeth, not many body fossils. So we don't really know. But less ambiguous vertebrates finally came about millions of years later, around 500 to 450 million years ago, and these were the armored jawless fish. I only give such a wide range in terms of time, 50 million years, because there are different fossils in the rock record that some of the very, very old ones, closer to 500 million years ago, are interpreted differently by different people. Some interpret them as armored fish, true vertebrates, and some interpret them differently. So the evidence of these armored fish going back all the way to 500 million years ago is not as strong, but they were definitely starting to get way more abundant in the fossil record by around 450 million years ago. And these guys had skeletons. They were true vertebrates and they had skeletons. However, they weren't internal endoskeletons like our own skeletons. They were phosphate exoskeletons. It wasn't until around 450 to 400 million years ago that fish with internal skeletons, cartilaginous and bony fish, evolved. First, we had cartilaginous fish closer to 450 million years ago, and then later we had the bony fish come about with internal bony skeletons. And cartilaginous fish, as I mentioned earlier with the shark example, have organic or cartilage internal skeletons rather than calcium phosphate like ourselves and bony fish. But these guys didn't have the first skeletons in the animal kingdom. Invertebrate animals, animals without vertebrae, were way ahead of the game. By 570 to 540 million years ago, in the Ediacaran to Cambrian period transition time range, they had evolved diverse carbonate, silicate, and organic skeletons. Because invertebrates are so diverse, different invertebrates within different groups or phyla evolved very different skeletons and independently from one another. In this whole entire video, we're going through examples of skeletons having evolved in different groups independently of one another at different times and in different lineages, which just speaks to how beneficial skeletons were for reasons we'll talk about later in terms of evolution, survival, natural selection, all of that, because of these convergent evolution examples. Convergent evolution just referring to the fact that one trait is evolving many different times in different lineages independently. And this was the case at this time. Although the time overlapped in terms of when they were evolving skeletons, they were a lot of the groups doing it independently. And I talk about all, well, not all, but most of these invertebrate groups in my invertebrate paleontology playlist, where I go over each phylum in itself and its rock record through time and what we know about it and what's still unknown about it and all of that. And so you guys can check that out. But in any case, these invertebrates had evolved skeletons of many different types by 570 to 540 million years ago. But what about the first microskeletons? Surely microorganisms had a head start on skeleton building since they were around since almost 4 billion years ago, right? Well, not necessarily. Yeah, they were around for that whole time, but it wasn't until around 540 million years ago that we see the first silica and carbonate exoskeletons or shells or tests in radiolarians and forams, respectively. And for diatoms and coccolithophores, like we mentioned earlier, it actually wasn't until 200 to 100-ish million years ago in the Mesozoic era that these guys, and therefore their skeletons, evolved. So overall, we can see a trend here. Most skeleton-producing life showed up right at or very close to the Ediacaran-Cambrian transition around 540 million years ago. But this was billions of years after life first evolved. So why? And do we see any examples of biomineralization or mineral-producing life before the Ediacaran-Cambrian transition? And why or why not? Well, to go through some notable examples, we do see some micro-silica scales around 630 to 650 million years ago. And so because these were so tiny, 10 to 30 microns, which is 0.01 to 0.03 millimeters, which, for your reference, the thickness of one single strand of hair on your head is 0.015 to 0.05 millimeters. So keep in mind how tiny these scales were. And this is a picture of diatoms which have silica parts of their skeletons. Just as reference, it wasn't necessarily diatoms that we know of that the scales were from 600 plus million years ago. I just put this here for reference. The actual silica scales that we found 600 plus million years ago are unknown in terms of their affinity, what life they belong to, what organism they belong to, but their scales nonetheless. So there could have been some sort of silica-producing microbes around that time, or at least before what we normally thought of as the beginning of skeletons around 540 million years ago. We also see possible evidence of carbonate skeletons as early as 1.2 to 1.5 billion years ago. But this might just be post-depositional replacement of organic material, so we're not actually certain what this would be. Again, the picture is not representative of what we found. I'm just putting up a picture of what I'm talking about, which is a carbonate skeleton. And we also see organic exoskeleton evidence from cyanobacterial sheaths, which are kind of like bacterial covers. They cover the cell in a sheath or material that protects them from things, which are preserved in the rock record from around 1 to 0.6 billion years ago, or 1 billion years ago to 600-ish million years ago in the Neoproterozoic, or later part of the Proterozoic eon. And these three examples represent the best I can do in terms of finding evidence for skeletons before the Ediacaran to Cambrian transition. The Ediacaran Biota themselves, which were around from around 635 to 540 million years ago, were originally thought to be completely soft-bodied, no hard parts whatsoever, therefore no skeletons. But carbonate and silica-producing groups have since been recognized, which are thought to represent early cnidaria, things like corals, or porifera, things like sponges. And now, based on more and more Ediacaran fossils and evidence coming out, it's thought that by the end of the Proterozoic eon, by the end of the Ediacaran moving into the Cambrian, animals had evolved the physiological pathways necessary to produce silica and carbonate skeletons. And then at that Ediacaran-Cambrian transition is when they kind of exploded. But I do want to put the disclaimer here that when we say explosion, like Cambrian explosion, or the explosion or major diversification of skeletonized animals, I want to specify that just because we say explosion doesn't mean it means fast. Obviously, this has happened over the entirety of the Cambrian period, pretty much, in different groups. And while it looks fast in the rock record, it does take place over millions of years. And so it's not necessarily an explosion in the way that we would think an explosion would be, which is fast. But the ultimate takeaway here is that skeletons were just clearly not as abundant before the Ediacaran-Cambrian transition as during and after. And so the major question is, why not? Well, we think that skeletons just required too much energy to justify before the Cambrian explosion. Why? Because predation, at least predation in a way that would have made skeletons beneficial, wasn't a thing yet. Yeah, sure, microbes could eat other microbes, but it wasn't like a skeleton was really going to do you much benefit there. So it's thought that the increase in predation at the Ediacaran to Cambrian boundary, when larger animals were evolving is what made building skeletons finally worth it, and thus, boom, explosion of skeleton life. And not only was predation an important driver of skeletal diversification, evolution of skeletons in all these different groups at the same time, but skeletal diversification was also a driver of predation. They drove each other. And this began the predator-prey arms race that has driven evolutionary advancement ever since. I mean, obviously, other things like climate change and environmental changes also drive evolution, but this particular predator-prey relationship that kind of came to be at this time, at this transition, was really important for driving evolutionary advancement since, at least in animals. But I know my audience and I know my commenters are quick to point out circular relationships. So you might be wondering, if predation drove skeletonization, what drove the evolution of predation? And if we're saying that it's the skeletal diversification, then what drove the skeletonization and diversification of that? You can't have this, circular thing without an initial trigger. So what was this initial trigger? And why did both of these things, the increase in predation and predator diversity, as well as the increase in skeletal diversity, occur at this Ediacaran Cambrian transition? Actually, both predation in the way of larger and more complex animal body plans, as well as skeletons, were favored chemically at this time due to the rise in molecular oxygen. Larger and more complex animal life was enabled as oxygen levels at the seafloor rose. Why? Because oxygen respiration, the metabolic pathway that animals undertake, as well as ourselves, has the highest energy yields of any metabolic pathway that life exploits on Earth. I have an entire video where I deep dive into this specific topic, how, oxygen respiration works and why it yields the highest energy of other metabolisms, what other metabolisms are that life exploits, and all of those things. And I will link it up to the top right for you. I think I have it titled How Life Got Big. So you can check that out for a deep dive into why and how exactly oxygen respiration works to create the most energy and allow life to become larger and multicellular and multifunctional and more complex. But this was one of the major factors that oxygen led to, which helped life become larger. And then once life was larger and there were different sizes of life instead of just microbe, single cell, obviously you had this, hierarchy. Bigger life eats smaller life. We see that all the time. And so once this happened, this kind of allowed for predation to start getting a little bit more complex than microbe on microbe. In addition to this, higher atmospheric oxygen levels led to more oxidative continental weathering, which is essentially just a process that breaks down the rocks on land, which transports their constituent ions, dissolves them, and transports whatever they're made of in the water, in rivers and such, down to ocean basins. And it leads to just greater influx of ions like calcium, phosphate, and carbonate into the sea, which are all the things that life needs to produce skeletons. And we see in the geochemistry of the rock record at this time, in this Ediacaran Cambrian transition, that there was a greater influx of calcium and phosphate to the oceans. And therefore, that is another thing that didn't necessarily drive skeleton production, but it allowed it to happen. And as predation started ramping up, because skeletons were energetically more favorable because of this chemistry change, this allowed them to produce the skeletons, which ended up helping many of them survive, clearly, because then all sorts of groups began producing skeletons and or learning how to burrow or whatever, trying to get away or protect themselves from predators. On top of all this, because oxygen had started to drive animal evolution to larger body sizes in themselves also played a role in driving the need for skeletons, or at least the benefits, the evolutionary benefits of having skeletons, both internal and external. They provide structural support as well as protection from predators. However, predation and body size were not the only evolutionary pressures that might have pushed life toward producing skeletons, specifically exoskeletons. It's possible that early life on Earth, before 2.4 billion years ago, used mineralized protection against UV radiation. Why? Because early microbes, especially phototrophs or photosynthesizers at Earth's surface, were extremely vulnerable to UV radiation before around 2.4 billion years ago because ozone hadn't formed yet. Remember the rise in molecular oxygen we talked about earlier? Well, there were two major times in Earth's history when Earth's oxygen levels, molecular oxygen levels, rose in the atmosphere and oceans. And this was around 2.4 billion years ago during the Great Oxidation Event, or GEO, and the NOE, or Neoproterozoic Oxidation Event, around 600 million years ago, just before the Ediacaran Cambrian transition, which is likely the one that triggered or helped to trigger the increase in skeletons and predations at that boundary. However, the GEO, the first one, was the one that really kicked off the beginning of the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere, at least. And the atmospheric oxygen, a lot of it at the time, went into building the ozone layer. Before this, there was no ozone layer in Earth's atmosphere, and thus a lot more UV radiation came through Earth's atmosphere. But we know that life was around before 2.4 billion years ago, before the GEO, because it's what caused the GEO. And so many early microbes likely produced, as they do today, UV absorbing pigments to help protect against the damaging light. However, they may have also produced mineralized skeletons, exoskeletons, or sheaths or coverings that helped protect against these UV rays early in Earth's history before ozone formed. For example, microbial mats incorporate carbonate cement or minerals into their mat structure, and this could have helped block those rays. And other microbes produce ferric minerals, iron-containing minerals, or silica, both of which also have absorption properties that could have helped allow essential wavelengths through, because you still need a photosynthesized sunlight, but also help block the harmful UV wavelengths of light. And actually, this might help explain why silica-producing organisms evolved in the first place. Because this is actually a little bit weird, because producing silica, at least in more modern oceans, takes a lot more energy than producing carbonate skeletons because it's way less abundant and therefore way less easy to secrete, to concentrate the ions that they need to produce those skeletons. And so why silica producing life originated in the first place is a major question. However, this idea of blocking UV light, although an interesting idea, is not obviously backed up yet with anything in the fossil record, as our first fossil evidence of silica-producing organisms like sponges or radiolarians isn't until around the Ediacaran Cambrian transition. There is some potential evidence that placed sponges all the way back to 900 million years ago, but this is still a billion plus years after the formation of ozone. So I don't know, but interesting idea, more research is needed. So here we have a timeline kind of summarizing the evolution of skeletons through Earth's history, at least the potential evidence for skeletons through time that we've talked about today. As you can see, there are many gaps that still need filling, and if any of this in this video sounded interesting to you, I highly recommend you jump into this research if you're at a point in your life where you're thinking about going into research. This is a really interesting field that has, obviously, as you can see, a lot of unanswered questions that I think are absolutely worth exploring. And with that, my references are down below as always, and I can't wait to see you guys in my next one. Bye.